Some of you know that I've been around a good while, and I don't know if you know anything about my backstory. So I'll start off with a little bit of that to help you know me a little better. Begin with a story, an incident that happened when we were on furlough in the 1970s. We had an invite to speak. I did at the WMU Annual Association meeting over close to, it was at a church over close to the Mississippi line, probably 50 miles west of Tuscaloosa. I can't remember the name of it now. So Maxine and I picked up my mom and stepdad at the railroad station in Birmingham and took them with us. And we had a lovely meal, a lovely meeting, fellowship, and good food. When I got ready to speak, the lady in charge said, "We're proud and happy to have our Alabama boy speak to us tonight," like I was a homeboy. I didn't look at my mom when she said that, but afterwards on the way home, my mom said, "I just wanted to stand up and say, that's not an Alabama boy, that's a Nebraska boy." And of course she was accurate about that. So I spent 17 years in Nebraska. I was born, grew up, went through high school. Because of a shortage of funds and so on, I joined the Army, and the Army brought me to Fort McClellan, Alabama. I was in basic training there, and right near the end of basic training, I had noticed cars going by the fort. Our platoon was out near the north gate, and we trained over there, and I saw the cars going by. So I asked one of the guys, I said, "Where does that road go?" They said, "It goes to Jacksonville." Well, you wouldn't know I made pretty good grades in geography, but what I thought was, oh, that's great. I always wanted to see Jacksonville, Florida. So I got a pass that Saturday afternoon and caught the bus to Jacksonville. I remember as we went into town back then, you could see the steeple of the old Baptist church over there about a block from the square. When I got out of the bus, I knew I was still in Alabama, but I started walking around, see the town, walked around the square, walked over by the church. It was on Saturday afternoon, like I said. Nobody was there, but as I walked around looking at the church, the Lord definitely spoke to my heart. And the Lord said, "I want you to go to church here." And I said, "Lord, if I'm not shipped out for my basic training coming up, I promise to do it." And I figured I'd be shipped out, but when the orders came out, I was transferred to work in the motor pool office at the fort. Ones of us that moved different places on the fort moved on Friday. I went to breakfast on Sunday morning. On the way back after breakfast, the Lord reminded me, "It's Sunday morning. You have a permanent pass. It's time for you to go to church." So I caught a ride with a fellow in his pickup truck, and he took me right to the door of the old church there. I was 18 years old. I felt like a young adult, so I went to the young adult department. We had a good time there, and when we got to Sunday school class, the fellow I sat with was a little bit older guy, but he invited me first to sit with him in church, and I did, and took me out and introduced me to his mother, whom I later learned to call Mom Bennett. The next Sunday, I invited my buddy to go with me, closest friend. 4 of us had signed up together, and Max went with me. His family was a nominal Catholic. They weren't active in church, but Max went with me. Now, Maxine wasn't on the scene, my future wife. She was at a classmate's wedding in Birmingham. But the second Sunday, she was there playing the piano for the Sunday school assembly, which was her regular assignment. And the fellow leading it, he had met me the first Sunday, and I guess he thought he could, for some reason, he asked me to lead in prayer. And I stood up and prayed, and Maxine told me later that she twisted around on the piano stool and took a look at me. The Lord must have helped her see something that day, because she wrote in our application form to the mission board, I knew I wanted to spend my life with that guy. And that's what happened, basically, but I didn't know it for a while because I had to find out a little bit later. And I kept going to church. My buddy became a Christian. Mom, Bennett, and Lamar took us in every weekend. We stayed with them. Maxine and I, our first date was on, well, I better tell you that I found out how she felt. Now, I was bedazzled. She was beautiful, had a beautiful voice. She was 5 years older than me. So I didn't have any ideas about ever dating her. But when I went to tell the family bye for a furlough and Christmas time, she gave me a send-off kiss and gave me a pretty good idea how things were. So when I got back, we started dating. Our first date was on Valentine's Day, and we decided maybe that night, well, I think we'd already decided to get married. It just seemed like it was all settled after that. And I don't remember if we ever proposed to her officially. I did give her a ring and bought her a cedar chest for our engagement. So we were making plans to get married right away and live in Anniston. She was teaching school at the neighboring town and just finished out the school year. But Uncle Sam shut down Fort McClellan for a while, and so we moved to Fort Jackson. Gave us a chance to be separated and a chance to write a couple more poems and send to her. But I got out of the Army and we got married November 1st, 1947. She had already gone to Birmingham and gotten a teaching job, found us a place to live, because I was going to start college as soon as I got out of the Army. And that's how we got started. And she worked, paid for me through school with GI Bill. I'm taking Kim's invitation broadly. I want to read you a poem that I wrote recently. I did write Maxine 2 or 3 a year, but I hadn't written in several years. And when she was sick and I was kind of not able to put words together very well. But recently I decided I should summarize our life together. So I wrote this poem. It's entitled My Final Ode to Maxine, written by Robert Stewart on this, the 3rd anniversary of her heavenly homegoing, November 24, 2020, and 73 years after my first ode to Maxine on Valentine's Day, 1947. As the oldest child in a broken home, I grew up fast in Nebraska land. No inkling of God's amazing plan awaiting me in Alabama. No money for college, my hopes to fulfill. God pointed me to the GI Bill. He took me very far away across those many miles to an army camp for basic near the source of my future smiles, and on to church in a nearby town to meet a local beauty of present and future renown. In face and form magnificent, and something best of all, an inner glow of heart and soul and love to all. She was so far above my league I could but only dream. Then God worked another miracle and made us His own team. In loving union at His call to serve Him through our times, in many parts of Alabama and further distant chimes. He took us off to old Siam, a family all fivefold, to show God's love to rich and poor and tell the gospel bold. Hers was a life of sacrifice to help me reach God's goal in schooling, preparation true, and pastoral ministry new. Then in a distant foreign land she was the wind beneath my wings, and God's true servant in her own ways, in teaching, music, and hospital days. And when our third chick left the nest, she met her final challenge clear as a Baptist press rep of renown for 18 final years. After 36 years in Old Siam, we came back home to rest. But she chose not a life of ease, but ministry at its best, in church, writing, speaking, and music in 16 scattered states. She finally got a chance to rest with dementia and TIAs. It was my privilege to care for her those last 10 years of her days. So I dedicate this poem to her, my final ode to Maxine, reliving those 70 years of bliss with my beloved Bama Queen, her loving, grateful, admiring husband and missionary co-worker, Bob Stewart. Okay, that poem gives you kind of a summary of how we met and what our life was. I went to college, and I was called to a church pretty early, and we did serve churches in Alabama for 9 years. In the meantime, I also went to seminary, and I became acquainted with Parker Memorial Church when we came to Eulison Baptist Church in 1955. The committee asked me to help teach the Howard College Extension Center on the book of Isaiah. So I came and taught that at Parker. It was in the room down under the sanctuary. So I was familiar with the building. And also during that time, I remember my mom visited us one time, and we came to a revival meeting a couple times here. The next contact with Parker was in 1962. Now, I mentioned about my mom calling me the Nebraska boy, which I was, but recently I got to thinking about it, and in fact, I spent 17 years in Nebraska and 75 years in Alabama. So maybe that makes me an Alabama boy too. Now, part of that years was in Thailand, but Alabama was our base. Okay, when we were home on furlough, our first furlough in 1962, Dr. Belock Davis asked if the church could adopt us and send extra money to the board and so on, and we were pleased. So we've been connected with Parker off and on for 65 years. So I didn't know how many of you really knew our background, and I wanted to tell a little bit about that. Going on to the mission story, I received my call in seminary in 1972. We were in a missions class and heard a testimony from a classmate who had been in Japan that summer, explaining the multitudes of people that hadn't got to hear the gospel, and very, very small number of missionaries and national workers. And so I was looking around the room to see if any of my classmates, I wasn't going to pick them or anything, but just were there any that probably would be good potential missionaries. And while I was doing that, the Lord spoke to my heart and said, "Why don't you go?" Well, that was a shock, but actually a very exciting thing. I felt so honored because I never really thought I was missionary material, and don't know if I really was, but the Lord seemed to see it. So I went home to tell Maxine. Well, at first she said she couldn't marry a preacher because of the hardships of the country preachers' wives that she'd seen in her community. She grew up on a farm. But we didn't talk about it anymore. Well, she asked me to think about being a pharmacist. And she said, you know, they help people too. And I said, I know, and if the Lord would let me be one, that would be nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. But I'm still praying, and so we left it up in the air. But when the time came to it, she's agreed, you know, and jumped in to help me as a good pastor's wife, and she was. But when I got home talking about going overseas, she hadn't come to that point, of course, and she went with to a missions program that night, and one of our Baptist people at the mission board spoke. He'd been a missionary in China, and when he gave the invitation, was anybody felt maybe led to go, and I turned to her, and she shook her head. And she told me later that she said, I would be happy to go and be your wife and the mother of our children and keep house and host us, you know, like a regular mother at home would be, but I haven't felt a call that I don't feel like I'm missionary material at all. I wouldn't know what to do over there. So later on, when once in a while I would feel more of a stirring, and we had some missionary speakers in one of our churches one time, and so she agreed to send off for the application papers to the mission board. They came, and we were in separate rooms in the house. We weren't conferring. Each one was signing it or filling it out, and she came in a few minutes and said, darling, I'm not going to lie to the mission board. Question number 5 said, do you know that God has given you a personal call? So that was required. It wasn't enough that they go with their husbands. And she hadn't had that call. And I said, well, darn, I don't want you to lie to him, and I wouldn't take you if you were lying about it. And let's send them back and see if we can just keep supporting mission work through our church. So that was in probably 1955. Well, every year at Bloody Moon time, you know, she said she was worried that the Lord was going to call her during that time. I mean, she had concerns about going overseas and how our little kids would be. Could we find a doctor even on for them? You know, we didn't know that much about it. But I think the call crept up on her. It came on Friday morning of 1957. It was the week of Bloody Moon week, and the second Sunday, I had found that not only the money through the organizations, but to preach on it again and pass the collection plate, because some of the men hadn't heard anything about it and hadn't had a chance to give, really, so that would give them an opportunity. And we did that in Pineapple, and then in our church here in Hewletton and Anniston, when we got there Lottie Moon week, and I talked to the deacons about it on Saturday night, and they said, well, we've never done it that way. We always just give through the organizations. I said, how much do we have? They said, about $49. I said, well, that's good, but I really feel led to do this, and they were very agreeable. And I just preached a regular mission sermon from the Bible, the Commission magazine, some letters from Bob and Jeannie Spear, who were our friends in seminary, and they were in Thailand working. And we took the offering, and it all totaled up to $500, which is not too big for that church, but biggest, you know, many times they'd ever had before. But what impressed me was that several of the deacons came up after that, and they said, Brother Bob said, nobody's ever told us about this before. Well, anyhow, that's another story, but we felt like if the Lord, it wasn't His will to really call us, that we could continue doing our best that way. But that morning, well, this was the last Sunday, 3 years later in 1950, 2 years later, 1957. And we didn't have a secretary. I had a mimeograph machine at the house, and I was getting the worship service, the bulletin ready. And when I was going over it, I called across the house. I said, "Darling, I want you to sing a solo this morning." Well, she was a natural. What's the second part? Alto. And she said, "Well, I don't do solos much." She said, "How about this other girl that sang a lot?" And I said, "No, I just want you to do it. I feel like it would be." Now, I honestly wasn't thinking about a call. I just wanted a nice atmosphere for preaching. And she agreed to it, and she asked me what number was, and I told her in the Baptist, the old Broadman hymn. Well, it's a missionary hymn. I almost hate to mention the name because it sounds like I was trying to trick her or something, but the name of the hymn is "How Long Must We Wait?" But it was by a native African who had been wanting a missionary and lived a long ways away, and he went back to see the missionary several times, but the missionary was already loaded down with work, so he said, "Well, maybe I can come later, but not now." So the native man said, "How long must we wait?" And that's how the song was written, and it goes through that in the hymn. But anyhow, okay, she agreed to do it. I had some errands to run that day and took off in the car to do some visiting. And she told me later how it happened. She was sitting at the piano rehearsing the song, and the Lord just touched her heart and let her know that He wanted her on the mission field too. She said, I sat and meditated while I prayed because I didn't want the emotions of it to be what caused it, but she said it was there, and the Lord kept letting me know. And several things about that day, but when I finally got home, she told me, and we were praising the Lord and praying, and she was folding our son's diapers on the sofa that night. He was just about 6 months old. So anyhow, when she had her call, all those fears and questions and doubts, as far as I could tell, they just went out the window. And we called the mission board, and we managed to get appointed within 6 months. One of the things that was a little bit of a concern was how she was going to tell her mom and dad. They were a very close family, a farm family, had moved to town, and her dad was a very gentle, he was a deacon, but a very gentle, soft, kind-hearted man, and he cried easily, very emotional. And we didn't know, when we told them what would happen, how they would feel, especially him. So we drove over to Jacksonville. That's where they lived, about 20 miles from where we lived. And on the way, we had, of course, the kids with us, and Sunday afternoon. We were trying to decide how to tell them in a tactful way, to kind of work into it gradually. As it happened, that wasn't necessary. When we opened the car door to get out, our two daughters jumped out and they hollered loud enough for the whole town, "We're going to be missionaries! We're going to be missionaries!" Well, okay, we went on in the house and nothing was said. And Ty would say, "Yep," I mean, total silence. And after a while, talking about the weather and the family and sports and whatever, Maxine asked her parents, said, "Mother and Daddy, did you hear what the girl said?" They said, "We heard." That was the end of that. No question, no follow-up. we went back to talking other things. And so we went home. The next day, Maxine's mom called her. She said, "We've had our cry now, and we can talk about it." And she said, "I want to tell you something that made it a little easier." Maxine didn't know till then that one of her pastors on the farm, an elderly man that loved her so much when she was a kid, he stayed at their home. It was a half-time church, so he stayed there pretty often, preaching weekends. And he told her that recently, or sometime in the past, he had preached on missions and how the Lord wanted missionaries and needed workers, and gave an invitation, and the only one that went forward was his own daughter. He said, "I'm ashamed to tell you this, but I talked her out of it right there and told her that it was some of the other young people he was calling." But he said, I don't know if it was that night or soon after that, the Lord gave him this feeling that Maxine was going to grow up to be a missionary. So they weren't entirely shocked or surprised. And though we had times of, sadness when we left, it wasn't trying to keep us at home. They were really supported us in their way. Okay, so we get appointed. After we called the Foreign Mission Board about Maxine's call, we were able to be appointed in record time of about 6.5 months. So we were appointed middle of July and got ready, and we drove through the Midwest, left our car and visited my family, rode the train out to San Francisco, and boarded around the 1st of October, boarded the President Wilson line. Back then, it was cheaper for missionaries to travel by ship than by plane. So we had a 3-week trip across the Pacific Ocean to Hong Kong. From there, we rested a few days, and went on into Bangkok on a plane. We got to Bangkok the afternoon of October 31, 1958. The next day was our 11th wedding anniversary. I got Mom a special ring, and the next day was Sunday. We started going to a Thai church, which we didn't understand anything, but even then our ears began to get acquainted with the Thai, familiar with the Thai language. The Thai language became our first challenge, and our first, we had a little time to settle in a rented house, and we did give out several thousand tracts and things we could do without knowing the language. And we started the school this January 1st, 1959. Now the Lord helped us realize that language is #1 priority, because we're going to work with Thai people, rural Thai people. Very few of them knew English, and so the language, we couldn't tell them about the Lord or the way to salvation or anything else without knowing their language. So we really dedicated ourselves to studying, and we went to language school. We started the 1st of January, went to language school 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And at home we studied for about 4 to 6 hours every day on our homework. I won't tell you much about the language. If I told you all of it, it'd take all my time. It's a wonderful language, but it's difficult for English people like us, because of all the more letters, 71 letters, 5 tones, and several other differences. The American Army said it's the 3rd most language in the world. But we worked at it hard, and I like I said, I knew that I had to learn it to be able to share the gospel. And then I was telling my son about a special motivation I got in language school. We met in an old building, but it had a beautiful lawn out in back. And we had a 5-minute break between our 4 classes. And one day, about halfway through my second year, I was just out walking, trying to relax and rest my brain. And I saw an amazing sight. In this big piece of lawn, there was a Thai lady squatting down with her skirt down over her knees, cutting the grass. As I tell people, she didn't have a riding mower or a power mower or even a plain push lawn mower. She was cutting it with a knife about 12 inches long. A little knife she had it and was just swishing it back and forth. Well, I was so amazed. I was standing there watching her in amazement. She turned toward me. I was on a little sidewalk there. She said, "Kun matamarai ni." She said, "What are you doing here?" I'm sure she didn't realize that was a school in that building. I said, "Pom Marian Pasat Thai crop." Used my most polite Thai. I said, "I'm here studying the Thai language, ma'am." She acted like she didn't believe me. She looked dubious. She said, "Kun Marian Pasat Thai Jing Jing Ru? Are you telling me the truth? Is that what you're doing here?" I said, "Crop, Po Marian Pasat Thai Jing Jing. Are you?" I said, "I really am here doing that." Then she laid out a long sentence on me. She said, "Ma, Luke Chai Kong Chan mi ayu 5 ขวบ เท่านั้นหนูยังไม่เคยเข้าโรงเรียนแต่พูดภาษาไทยเก่งกว่าคุณอีกเยอะ." She said, "My little boy is only 5 years old. He hadn't even started school, and he speaks Pasa Thai, the Thai language, a lot better than you do." Well, I thought I'd been doing pretty well, and I tried to use it, but I realized I wasn't ready to quit school yet, that I needed to work harder. So I finished up that year studying as hard as I could. In 1960, we got to move out to our place of service. This was a town about 80 miles east of Bangkok, a provincial capital. They had a small, mostly Chinese folks church from people that had moved from China. The kids were going to Thai school, so they were beginning to use the Thai language more. And they welcomed us with open arms. We got such a welcome that we felt right at home. And we started going out once a month to help with the preaching as much as I could and getting acquainted. So we were ready to move. We found a very adequate rented house and got moved in and got started in our work. We worked with the church in language, teaching English and helping with the Bible teaching. We also, because the year before I'd had a chance to go on a survey trip and travel all over our province. There were about 350,000 people there. And we went to every little, like county seat town and market and small villages, wherever there were people living. And just checking it out helped me find my way around, for one thing. But we had a team. I was the newcomer. Our pastor and a fellow missionary and 4 seminary students went with us. And they did some preaching while I was observing. So all over the province we went for 5 days. And so because of that, when we moved out there, I knew where to go to start street preaching. In this province there was that one little church, and actually all over the territory of southeast Thailand where Southern Baptists were trying to start work because other missionary groups had gone to other parts of the country. There were 3 million people and only 4 churches. our church, one in the next province, or two over there, and one rural church. Can you imagine? I think Alabama had 4 million people at that time. Can you imagine what it would be like in Alabama with 4 churches? Probably, I don't know where we'd put them for sure. Maybe Mobile, Montgomery, Alabama, or that big town up north where they send rockets up. But can you imagine the people living there and the pastors trying to reach out to all that territory? So another thing about it, as we traveled around early on, when our team asked people, young and old, were listening, what, do you have any questions? The main question everybody asked was, what is a Jesus? They heard the word Jesus in the preaching. They said, we've never heard that word before. Well, I hadn't forgotten that. And on the way back to Bangkok after that trip, our seminary students were singing out of the old Presbyterian hymnal. Those folks had gotten to Thailand a long time ago and had a hymnal. They were singing, "Send the light, send the light. There's a call comes ringing over the restless waves, send the light." Well, I was driving the car and listening and thinking, and it just hit me like a bolt of lightning. It sounds overstretched, but from all the history that we knew and from the response of those people, this is probably a part of God's world that had never heard the gospel. Well, this was 1960. It wasn't way back in the Bible days, but it sounds like some of those places where Paul went, in his missionary journey. So I realized how big a job it was going to be. Well, impossible, but what a challenge. And in my mind, I was thinking, Lord, I know you don't work this way, but could you send me Paul and Silas to help? Or if you couldn't do that, maybe Billy Graham. And I said, Lord, if you can't, if this is the best you got, this country preacher from Alabama, you help me and I'll do the best I can to start reaching these people. So the best way we knew to do it first was to get out on the street in those little towns and villages, preach to them, give them gospel tracts, answer their questions. And that's what we started doing. We had 18 places that we went to each month. Now, this wasn't scheduled. We went and we'd get out. Sometimes I had some help. Sometimes Maxine went with the accordion and the kids. A lot of times I went by myself, but however, we'd find a shade tree or an empty lot or a place by the market, and I'd get out and start singing. Now, those of you that know me, you can imagine what that might have sounded like, but it was an attraction. Here's this tall white guy, probably the tallest guy that ever went there, and whitest maybe, and he's out there singing to us, and what's going on? So it did attract some people. And I had some pictures of Jesus on the cross and other Bible pictures that I used some, and just talked to him about the true God and his son Jesus, who came to make a way for us to be forgiven for our sins and have a home with him in heaven. Well, the Thai people, they're pretty well bound by tradition, and they have an ancient religion that teaches them that all religions are good and just make your choice. And that's not true. We know that if all religions had taken care of people, Jesus wouldn't have had to come. So we had to try to explain it in a polite way. We didn't want to offend them or turn them away, and quit listening. So we had to pray for wisdom from the Lord in our preaching. and share it in a kind, polite, loving way to show them how the Lord loved them. That Jesus just didn't come for white people, that God, the true God, is of the whole world, and that this is a way for everybody in the world to be forgiven of their sins. Well, it was challenging, and some of them would ask questions that gave me a chance to explain it a little more. One interesting thing, the second place I went to on that tour, around the province, was a little town by the name of Bangkla. It was a little bigger, though, than most of the villages, and they actually had a city government, but I didn't know much about it when I went there, but I went there to preach probably about the second time. And I saw this nice-looking Thai fellow over there listening. When I quit preaching and asked for questions, he came over and he said, I want to know what Baptists are doing in Thailand. Well, I think he introduced himself. He was the mayor of that little city. I forgot his name. But he said, I want to know what Baptists are doing in Thailand. And I said, well, we are here. The living God has sent us here to help Thai people both physically and spiritually. And I said, as a matter of fact, we have a missionary doctor studying the language. She's already here. 2 more on the way. We are planning to build a hospital out here in southeast Thailand somewhere. We're going to survey, we have a committee that's going to survey all the provinces and decide where we should put it. Well, he lit up. He said, oh, we've been wanting a hospital for many years, but we haven't been able to get enough money together. He said, if you folks will come here and build your hospital, we'll help you all we can. And we can't give you the land, but we'll see you get a fair deal, and we'll work with you on it. And, well, we got excited and started talking, and I said, well, could I bring some of our folks, our survey folks, and our doctor, and out here to meet you and talk about it? So we set up a meeting right away, within a week or two, and they came out, we talked about it, they were excited, they took us over and showed us a piece of land near the main road that might be a possibility. And our doctor and committee were excited, but we had to tell him, now we've got all these other provinces to survey first, and then we're going to talk about it and pray about it and decide where to put it. Well, the word came just several months later. The committee voted unanimously to put it in Bangkla. So before long, people were out. We got the land, these building plans, started building it, and they were getting the staff together to work there. In the meantime, our first term of service had run out, and we came to the States in 1962 on our first furlough and visited many churches. We probably visited many of you, and we certainly became acquainted with Parker Memorial and began working with y'all, and you began supporting us in a special way. The first term, in addition to the street preaching, where we didn't have too many people showing much interest, because when you become a Christian in Thailand, your family turns against you and probably lose your job, and it was pretty hard to take a stand for the Lord. So we weren't trying to get people to make a decision before they understood what was involved. So that first year was mostly seed sowing. But one of the 18 places where I went, some people got some of my tracts, and I won't tell you the whole story, but the Lord led me out there to this coffee shop on the boat landing, and when I was talking to some men out there one night, The young guy ran out, a young person went out and said, the man that runs the coffee shop wants to talk to you. I went in, he said, he held up a tract, he said, one of the boat drivers got one of these tracts and took it home, and they want you to come up and talk to them. Now, they lived about 45 minutes boat ride up the canal. So we set up a date to go the next night. I went back out there and we got on the boat, and Thai style, now I might tell you a few of the things about Thai culture along, but usually if people are wanting to go somewhere and they see that you're going there, they might ask to ride with you. So I was the only rider in the boat, and they asked if they could ride up to a temple that was having a fair, a yearly fair, about halfway up to the house we were going to. And so they piled in. We carried a boatload of folks. They got out at the temple. I went on up to this market where the people lived. It was like a little village on stilts, every one of them, because there were no roads in there. Everybody went in by boat. And the house we met in was close to the main intersection, maybe like First Avenue and Main, or whatever. Okay, we pulled up to the boat landing. Went to the village there on the water, pulled up in front of the house, and I got up and went in, and they welcomed me. They were real Thai people. One of the men, the house owner, was a school teacher. And there were four pretty large, 2 or 3 families together. We had about 6 or 8 people or more. But that night, they said, we've been observing, where we live, the beautiful sky and stars and moon and the water, this beautiful world, and we know somebody had to make it. No, it couldn't make itself, but we don't know what his name was. I said, well, I'll be glad to tell you. So I told him about the Lord, God's creation, how he made it. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but I emphasized that God made it, and he came to earth later because people sinned and were being punished for it, but God wanted to help us escape from our sin. So he came into the world, and his name was Jesus. He taught and lived and died on the cross for our sins so we could be forgiven and go to heaven instead of hell. Well, I couldn't preach all night. I preached for about an hour maybe, but I said, would you like me to come back and teach some more and bring some other Christians with me to meet you? And so they agreed, and a couple of weeks later we were able to take some young people from our church, go out on a Saturday, and we got started going there regularly. Started going every Saturday night for a number of, quite a few years altogether. And we didn't have fast believers. They were listening. I wanted several in the family to understand and be ready to trust the Lord so they could support each other when they started getting opposed and criticized and persecuted maybe, and I didn't want that for them. So I guess people started accepting Christ, and we had about 16 people after 3 or 4 years. We baptized them there right in front of the house in the boat landing, and there were people all around looking across the canal to see them. This was a good testimony because a lot of times when a Thai person became a believer, he'd rather be baptized somewhere where not too many people knew about it because he knew what he would face. And some went to our Baptist camp down on the ocean, but they were baptized right there in front of their house. We worked there. In the meantime, we were asked to work at the hospital. Now, some of you may remember, skipping a little bit, in August of 1964, we came back to the States on a medical leave because Maxine had contracted a weird disease with huge purple nodules, bumps on her leg, and we went to 10 different doctors through that first year, and nobody could figure out what to do. So the doctor from our Foreign Mission Board suggested we go back to see a doctor in the States, and they gave us 3 choices. One was UAB, so that's what we took. And I can't always remember the doctor's name, but he was very experienced internist. He was one of several authors of medical textbooks. I know when we heard who we were going to see, I told our missionary doctor friend at the hospital about it, and he said, "Oh, he's one of the best. He wrote my textbooks." So we did go there, and he found out what it was, and we spent several months testing out the medicine. So we got to go back to Thailand, though, in the latter part of November. And when we got back that time, the mission asked us to go work at the hospital. They wanted me to be the chaplain and evangelist, and wanted Maxine she could still help teach homeschool our kids and also teach English in the hospital at first. So that took up, a good bit of our time, and it meant that we would have to travel 20 miles further to go to Bang Pinoy, was the name of that village. At the end of about, 7 years, they were ready to be constituted into a church meeting in that home. And on the night of the dedication service, we had quite a few visitors, and we asked the teacher, Kunsen Ngiem, where we met, to give a history of the church. And he started out by saying, well, John Stewart started coming out here 7 years ago, and we weren't sure about him. We thought he might be a spy, or a Russian agent or CIA, but he's been coming 7 years, and now we're convinced that we can trust him. So that taught me something about working with Thai people, and maybe other people too, but they have to learn that you're on the level and you care about them, and you're not doing it because of something you want. But anyhow, we got the church started. Back at the hospital, it changed our work some, because instead of going out to preach in the street, we worked with the patients that came to the hospital, and they found out that we had good medicine and the doctors cared. At first, they weren't sure about the foreign doctors, and some of their own, I don't know what you call them, fake doctors that tried to practice Thai people would tell them that stay away from these foreigners, they don't tell them what they'll do to you. But those that had the nerve, and then the mayor and some of the leaders ensured the people that we were going to help them. So we had a good practice going. People came from hundreds of miles to our hospital to be treated. And of course we had the outpatient clinic where they could come and see the doctor, and if they were sick, we had ER and the beds. And so working there, you had a lot of chances to work with people. We worked with our staff. We had quite a few Christians, but some we had to hire that weren't, and so we talked to them, and my wife taught English to the nurse aides to be able to work with the patients and the doctors, and she was able to witness to them about and teach the Bible too. And in the morning we had a preaching service, and we talked to the outpatients, and then I visited all the beds, all the inpatients that we had, and witness when I could, and also sometimes explain more about the doctors, what they were telling them. And then in the afternoon, it's when I went out into the boondocks, wherever, to visit people that had been at the hospital and need following up on. So I got lots of exercise. I could drive to some places, had to ride boats a lot, rode bicycles sometimes, walked a lot of times. You know, I got in stayed in pretty good shape out there. I remember one day we were at the house, and this American lady, an older lady, came to talk to us. She found out she was a university professor up in one of the colleges in the Northeast. She studied homes, there's a word for it, different kind of buildings and things like that. And she heard about a special house out that way, went to our police station. She thought they would probably know about it because they traveled all around, and they told her, we never heard of it, but go over to John Stewart's house, said he knows this territory better than we do. Well, I didn't know about that house, but I thought, well, that's kind of a compliment, I guess. But anyhow, we've spent a lot of time visiting people, and if they were interested and wanted us to come, we could have teaching in their home. Mostly at night. I walked through dark rice paddies many a night to get to those homes. And it was a very challenging work. We had a map up in the chaplain's office where we put the pins representing one visit or more visits or home services, and that part of Thailand was pretty well dotted at one time. In 1970, we had a little change in venue. You know, we'd been living out in the country, and the mission asked us to move to Bangkok and fill in at the Baptist Student Center. The director there had a health problem and had to return to the States. And so we were there for 3 years working there, and it was a different kind of work, and it was work that I'd never participated in, but we enjoyed the students. It was mostly an English teaching program. And when we started there, they had quite a few classes lined up, so Maxine and I just divided them between the two of us and started looking for help. I called the U.S. Army chaplain to see if he had any of the guys there that thought they might be interested. And he said, well, I don't have anybody I can think of, but I need some help here. He said, somebody told me about your wife and her relationship with how well she could talk to Thai ladies. And he said, we have this class, orientation class here for what we call the Thai wives, either Thai ladies married to GIs or engaged. Well, he asked me if I thought Maxine would be interested. I said, well, you have to talk to her. So I gave him my phone number because she had been a little upset seeing the Thai girls hanging on to the American boys and weren't sure, you know, what all they were up to. And so she wasn't too sympathetic at that time, but he called her and talked to her, and he said, I know the problems here, and he said, they're going to marry whatever we say about it, and he said, 85% of the marriages have not worked, and they've come back home, so if we can, we'd like to give them some orientation, you know, about America and what was where it was and how to live there. And so she said, well, I'll try. I don't know if I can do it or not. But we had like a 2-month class, and she started, and the first day she said, well, let me explain a little more. They taught English and Bible and cooking and American customs and traditions things that would help them feel at home more when they came to the States. And so she asked them to write a little autobiography of their life. And she said, if you can write it in English, that's okay. If Thai, well, I'll get my husband to translate it. So she brought the letters home that day, and I remember she asked me to translate one, and I started doing it, and it was just a terrible, sad story. This girl was in a large family up north. They were poor. They couldn't even feed all the family, and these people, scammers from Bangkok, showed up and promised to, if they would let them take their daughter, they would get her to school in Bangkok and, help her have a better life. Well, of course, she wound up in a brothel and had just a terrible time. And anyhow, Maxine stopped me from reading, and she said, that's enough. Said, I don't want to read anymore. But it helped to see the true situation with these young women. And she really felt sorry for them, and she really dedicated herself there to help them. And so she headed up that program for, well, really about 3 years. And we would, at the end of each term, we would have them come to the house for a little fellowship time and cookies and punch and things. And the chaplain would usually come by and be there with us, and maybe a Thai pastor of ours. And I remember one Sunday, one of these girls told Maxine, said, I didn't know you could have any fun without whiskey. Because we certainly didn't have any, but I think she'd never been to a place, where you could really enjoy each other and talk and all without having to be drinking. But that was one thing I remember coming out of that. And then Maxine, she ate some meals in some of their homes and got to know them better. And the chaplain got us a pass to the GI Hotel, one of them there, where some of the couples would come in, So that was pretty neat. It was just a little walk from our house, and we went down there, just once in a while on Saturday night and got us a bite to eat. Okay, well, she's still, though, teaching at the Student Center, and in order to help these girls feel more at home with Americans, she took a course with the Red Cross, so she could be a Red Cross helper in the American Army Hospital. And then several of the young Thai women, they signed up and they worked in the hospital as long as Ma'am was there closer by. So that was another way she had of helping them. One of our side ministries, I don't really call it a ministry, it was a blessing. We got acquainted with several of the GIs, the American GIs. We were members of a Thai-speaking church, but on Sunday night we would usually go to the English-speaking church and met some of the boys there, and one of them was a boy from her hometown of Arab, Alabama. And he was very homesick. Well, in fact, he said his mother and Maxine went to college together. But anyhow, Paul Maxwell. He, in the hotel where he was living, he had met a new friend from Arkansas. This boy was very homesick. He was newly married, and they had a baby on the way, and he had been drafted in a bad way because the guy that should have been drafted was passed over, and he was the last draftee from their county. And he was on the verge of, well, he was very unhappy on his job because he was a forestry man. And on the job in Bangkok, he had a radio transferal system, something there with the Army. And he said that concrete jungle was about to get to him. He had started drinking, and Paul was worried for him that he was going to go AWOL. And the fellow on the draft board that arranged for the boy to get passed over was a pastor of the First Baptist Church there, and so I think he was kind of he wasn't sure about going to see missionaries, but you know, we were friendly, and he settled in, and we also, these fellows did help us teach, so they got acquainted with the Thai students. And then we met another GI who was from Fort Worth, Texas, and he became part of our extended family. And then an Army nurse from Florida, very active Southern Baptist girl. I guess we met her at church too, probably, and she started coming by the house, and after a while, she was a captain. After a while, there was a young corporal came to the hospital to work as an aide, and she asked him to, well, he was a handsome guy, real handsome, but a wonderful guy, and she asked him to teach her the guitar. And this lasted about half a lesson, and they started dating, and he came with her to the house, and he was a Jewish boy, but he accepted Christ there while he was there, and so we had quite a little family, and for a little while we had 3 British Peace Corps girls. First one we met was a Baptist. We met her at the church, and they were just out of high school, and she was in a very hard situation there, and taught at an old school, and they just had her stay in one of the schoolrooms, and had outdoor walkways to get to the house, and if she wasn't there at mealtime, they'd just leave the food out on the floor, and most of the time it was full of bugs when she got back, so she was very lonesome, and she introduced us to 2 of her friends. One was on another town by Bangkok, and one was down country, so sometimes we would have quite a big crowd at our house. You know, they weren't always all there at the same time, but we had a little prayer meeting one night a week, and a lot of times after we got through teaching, because now the girls, British girls, couldn't help us, but all of our GI friends were helping us with the teaching at the student center. Well, at the same time this was going on, I was still going back out to the country. I told you about Bang Pinoy. I always went out there from the eastern side, you know, before, but when this was on the west, so I could drive out there every Thursday night from the Bangkok side. And Larry, the forestry boy, he especially appreciated it, because we could get out in the wide open country in the rice fields, and it was just his cup of tea, you know, to be out like that, and so that was a big help. So that was going on, and then about halfway through that time, our mission business manager was on furlough, so I took that job by default. No one else felt like they could do it, and somebody had to do it, so that I did that for a year. So it was a kind of a rather busy time, and then we had a big conference one time to set up, and that worked out real good. And so Bangkok was missionary work of a different kind, but we enjoyed it, and Mom was very active and effective in it. When our 3 years were up, the mission asked us if we'd like to stay on at that job, and we thought about it, but about the last Sunday before our time was up to come on furlough, all of our GI friends had never been out to see our former church in the hospital, so we made a trip out on a Sunday afternoon. And as you come into our town, where we used to live, from the backside, there were some beautiful rice fields. And I remember that Sunday afternoon when I saw just that scene, the Lord let me know we should come back out there. I just felt drawn to it. And Maxine was very ready to. And so when we came back from furlough in 1974, we moved back out to our former hometown and got settled into our other kind of work. Well, the house hadn't been lived in, the mission house, for 9 years because we'd been at the hospital a while, you know. So we had to kind of wait, and they did some repairs and got it ready. But we got moved in after a while and got started helping at the hospital again. And by that time, one of our other missionary co-workers, and two of them actually, had started a little study, kind of a training class for some of our rural pastors and new members. And he asked me to help teach in that, and I did teach a couple of times, and then the fellow in charge felt like his time was up in that, and so they asked me to take that over, and that was what we started, what we called the Baptist Leadership Training. It was kind of like seminary extension classes, and they were set up for every second month. We had 4 days meeting with the men. They came to the hospital town a couple of times and met in the church there, but in order to make it handier, closer by for most of them, we moved our meeting place up country, up closer to Cambodia in one of those small churches there, and met there for a number of years. I had actually been in some of the homes. We just have little Bible studies, you know, in the homes, but this became a little more scheduled, and it was my privilege to teach and line up teachers and set the curriculum and line it up. And when I was gone on furlough, one of the other missionaries helped out with it. After we'd been doing that for several years, our mission voted to bring that into the seminary setup. Now, when there was a shortage of teachers in Bangkok at the seminary, I got to help fill in sometimes there, but this was to be like a seminary extension from our seminary. And these men that had been studying with me all that time were going to be able to get a seminary diploma from that study. So the graduation was set up in the fall of 1992. I remember very well, and in order for these men to graduate, and they all had plenty of hours, but I had to write up all the tests so they could pass the tests, and we did that. Some of them by then were either blind or too old to come to the school, to the church there, and so I took the tests out to them. And the ones that were blind, I let them take it orally. Anyhow, we were getting everybody tested up, you know, and ready to graduate, as it were. But one of the older gentlemen whose daughter was in the seminary, she was going to get her bachelor's degree that night. And I said, well, Lung Tanam, don't you want to? I could give you these tests orally. Don't you want to graduate? He said, no, I don't want to steal the limelight from. His daughter's name was Saguni. Her nickname was Noak, which means bird. He said, I don't want to take the limelight from bird. But he came that night. Well, we had 11 of them ready, and we got their pictures in a local photography shop, and they had on black pants, white shirt, and black tie. They didn't have a robe. This was it was not up to the bachelor level. It was a certificate. But the seminary folks, I appreciate them. They sent word to all of them. That was like our 40th anniversary, and they had all the alumni and the current students come to this seminary for a weekend of celebration. And meetings and fellowship. And so these fellows got invited. They got to go stay at the seminary. Now, they lived way out in the country. Some of them never been to Bangkok, so this was quite a treat. But they had to get their own way, either by bus or train or car or boat, however they could get there. And talking with them later, they really felt special about that. Okay, the graduation was on Monday night. Maxine and I chartered a bus, so it went around all the different villages where they lived and picked up their wives and children when they wanted to go. And so we had a busload come in late afternoon that day, and we had a couple of Thai fellows that cooked at the Calvary Church there, and it was kind of right beside our mission office building. So the bus pulled in that open space, and they fixed us supper. Everybody standing around out in the yard there eating the supper. It was a good meal. And then it was time for the ceremony. And the 11 men, now about 4 of these were leprosy fellows that had been arrested cases of leprosy. But some of them had had it a while. You could see scars on their faces. Some of them didn't have all their fingers. So they were up there, and we were all sitting up in the choir loft. The upper level graduates had their robes on, and the faculty was up there, and so they let me sit up there and say a word or two. But then when the time came, all of them were presented. The ones got their degrees, and these fellows got their diplomas. And some of the churches in town had prepared little gift packets for all the graduates. And so they came down and presented them to these country guys. My goodness, I don't think I cried that night, but I just felt, that they were getting some recognition, and the town folks there, they didn't even know we had anything going on up there, but they were very impressed, very kind. Well, I was wearing a Royal Thai shirt. When we got back on a furlough in '74, we found out that, because I went to a pastor's meeting in Bangkok before we moved out, a lot of them were wearing this different kind of shirt. Instead of coats and ties and so on. When we had special occasions in Thailand before, we'd wear a suit and tie just like here. Well, the king had noticed that in the Philippines, they had a national dress shirt for the men. It was a very nice, comfortable, long-tailed shirt, white shirt, very thin cloth usually. And that was acceptable, in place of a tuxedo. So I didn't know about this. This happened while we were on our furlough, but when we got back in '74, some of the pastors were wearing those shirts, and they told me about it. So I had a couple made, and they were so much cooler than a coat and tie. And for then on out, as long as we were in Thailand, maybe for a wedding, maybe I would wear a suit or a funeral. But for all preaching in church and all other formal occasions, you could wear those shirts. So the shirt I was wearing was a beautiful shirt, but it was very special because these country men, world men that I'd been teaching, they gave me the money to buy that material. Now, most of these men were very poor. I mean, they farmed and what they could and raised buffaloes, and some of them made a little bit more, but most of them just kind of from one day to the next. So I was very honored and in tears when they gave me that money because I knew what it represented, but I appreciated it, and they gave me enough for Maxine to have a special blouse made. So she was in in the audience wearing her beautiful blouse, and a lot of them, when they came up to talk to her, they wanted to know if that was a blouse that they had given her, and it was, so they were happy about that. All right, they got their diplomas and their gifts, and we had a lot of little fellowship, and then the men got on the bus with their families, and the bus took them back home. So that was quite a special night. Now unless they were the real older fellows, they kept coming to leadership school, and several of the younger ones, when they finished with us, they would go on to the main seminary in Bangkok. So my work for probably from 74 till 93. I did help at the hospital some, and preached in some churches that they invited me, but my main work was teaching and writing a lot of the study materials. We didn't always have too much good Bible study lessons and things that we could use, so I got started writing on those. I had written a book when we first went to the hospital entitled How to Be a Christian, because I realized when people, a lot of them, some of them didn't ask any, but some would ask, they'd say, how do you join up? They thought about it kind of like joining a club or something. And they said, if I join, what are my duties going to be? Well, you can't sit down, and tell them in one sitting. I realized that we needed something else, so I took time out and read back through the New Testament and wrote this book on how to be a Christian, which started with what you have to understand about God and Jesus, and about Jesus coming, and his saving work for us. And then the second chapter was how you actually become a Christian. You don't have a special ceremony or any tradition. It's in your heart. You have to make that decision. And the third chapter was, what are the first duties of a Christian? Find a church home, be baptized, give your witness to other people. If you don't have anybody meeting around you, start a meeting in your home if you can. And the fourth duties were the lifelong duties of a Christian. Duties toward God, duties toward your church, duties toward your fellow man, duties toward your family, duties toward your government and society. So we got that printed up, and the Thai pastors read it and gave me suggestions, and fortunately quite a few people used it in different meetings. As far as I know, it's been about 100,000 published, but probably hasn't. I don't know if any have been printed in recent years. So that was, and I've written some tracts, gospel tracts. But later on, when I got into leadership school, I started writing question and answer sheets to help them study, and we'd go over them together, and wound up with 60 lessons on John, 100 on Acts, and 60 on Romans. And we used those. I even mailed some of those to the States, where there were some Thai Lao churches here in the States that used them. And my last, I also corrected one of the school books that was printed by the Thai government. They started this. They had this class on different religions. I forget the name of it. I learned all about all the different religions. Comparative religion it was. But the chapter on Christianity was written by a Catholic fella, Thai Catholic, and part of it we could keep, but part of the doctrine and all was not biblical because of his background. And some of the local teachers asked me to come and teach it, and if they were Christian, they asked me to teach the Christian, not the Catholic. So I did write a book revising that. It was not printed it was printed by our department, and a lot of schools used that. But my last written project was a commentary on the Christmas story. Every December, our December leadership school fell in December. And so we would focus on studying about the Christmas story and all the messages there. And the Lord just put it on my heart to write this up where it could be maybe helpful to our rural pastors. And I had it pretty well written, and I realized I needed to give them some sermon outlines and some help along that way. And I said, now this is just a suggestion. You can add to it or use what you want of it. But I wound up with about 60 outlines to go at the end. And that took a few years to work on, and a while to get it actually printed up correctly. But I've heard pretty recently that some of them are still using it. So all of this was, the writing part was going down in the downstairs of our house, a mission house. In 1975, the mission asked Maxine to be the Baptist press rep for Thailand. We'd always had that position. People that had it would write in a few things. Well, when they asked her to do that, in mission meeting, she said, I've never had journalism or any studies on it, so I don't think I'm probably qualified. But they said, who's been getting the stories printed out? She had several, about Thailand work, the hospital. And that was true. And we had an editor of the Commission magazine that came out fairly early, and he was complimenting on it. He said, anything you want to write, send it to us. So they said, we feel like you're the best qualified. Well, I was sitting by her there, and she said, now, darling, if I take this job, you're going to have to help me. I said, I'll help you. She said, do you promise? I said, I promise. So we were kind of a team. Now, she's the one that wrote the stories, and she went out and got most of them, interviews, and when we had the refugee, invasion or movement, we had special medical teams from our churches that came to help, and they wanted, write-ups on those. And so we did spend quite a bit of time in the refugee camp for several years off and on, which is it was about 250 miles from where we lived, but we could go down there and stay in a local little motel, and she could get pictures and interviews. I remember seeing her sitting on a slab there with our Khmer Rouge general who had to flee from the Chinese, and she was interviewing him. And so, 90% of all of her material she had gathered herself, but I was in all of our leadership schools and a lot of the Thai churches around that part of the country, and so I could bring reports to her also from those meetings, and those were going in. And then, she did this for 18 years, from 75 till we came to retire in 93. And for her, it was not just a full-time job. I think it was a time and a half, because she would get to record the interviews and things and come to her office upstairs, which used to be our oldest daughter's bedroom one time, and sit at her desk, and she had a machine that she could listen and stop her with her foot. That had been a gift from one of the doctors that she got acquainted with from the States in the refugee camp. And she would work day and night, literally all night sometimes, getting those out on a deadline. And my help in that was to, after she got them all ready to go, I'd take them to the post office for her. When she was still doing that, maybe 5 years before she was out of that, or maybe more sooner, the idea came to her about doing a family newsletter for the mission family. Because we heard some from others in mission meeting, but we didn't always know too much about what's going on in other parts of the work. So she asked people to send in reports of what's going on with them. And she would put all of those in a mimeograph. Well, not she typed it up, and they ran it off on a machine up at a shop, what is that called, son? Xerox, there you go. And that was very well welcomed by our mission and many of our MKs, and went to school, and I think that was appreciated by everybody in the mission. So that also took a lot of her time. So she's upstairs working day and night. I'm doing my typewriting down in the dining room. In the meantime, in 1983, I started dealing with lymphedema in my right leg, which the old name was elephantiasis. I did not know that. And the Thai people called it elephant foot. But anyhow, my leg was swelled up, and they worked. First they thought it was a blood clot, and then they found out it was lymphedema. But I was supposed to lay down and elevate my leg about 6 hours a day if possible. And I cannot write very well on my back. So we figured out a way I could sit at the end of our dinette table. This was an old-style dinette table made out of metal with that kind of covering that sits, I can't remember. We bought it at Selma, Alabama, when we lived at Pineapple when I was pastoring it. We took it to Thailand with us, and we actually used it as a fancy table, too. We got some wooden ends built just the right height out of black. Put one at each end, cover it with a tablecloth. You could seat a lot of people, and we tried to entertain all the new missionary families, let them come out and see them, learn about their work, and have a home-cooked meal. A lot of that we would do at Christmas time. But anyhow, that made a big table that we could, feed quite a few people. And that was another one of her ministries, really being a hospitality lady, and the Chinese lady that helped us, she loved to have company too. But this table, just by itself, it had square corners. And I figured out I could sit and put my leg up over the corner of the table. I had a lap board and a clipboard, and I could put my Bible and reference books on the table and chairs. And that I could work there all day long, and I still had my leg up, so I managed to work through that, One of our doctors said you might want to go to the States and have that checked out and find out, but we had doctors in Thailand that knew that okay. So we kind of had a writing machine going there, English in the second floor and Thai on the first floor. And most of you know, if you've done any writing, it takes quite a bit of time, and you don't see the results real easy, but that was a big part of our ministry the last 18 years. And then I got to publish a a church newspaper. We called it the rural type Baptist churches, the ones that were out of Bangkok. And there's another case for a long time. There wasn't much exchange of news or what was going on. And a Thai pastor friend of mine talked about it and decided we ought to have this newspaper, not only for the news, but to announce upcoming meetings, conferences and so on. Because a lot of times people wouldn't know about it. We didn't have any nationwide kind of paper or system. And so I said, John Wheatar, would you take on that job? And he said, no. He said, you get to go more places now. He worked at the hospital and close by to several groups. I think he's still working. He's in his probably 80s now. But he didn't have as many contacts, so I started writing that once a month on 2 sides of a long sheet of paper. And I did that for 13 years, so that was another Thai writing project that I had. One thing that in our mission experience in Thailand that was a challenge and an unusual and an experience in our lives that we probably never would have had otherwise was in 1979 when the Cambodian refugees started coming across the border. There were several camps set up. One of them was pretty close to where we had a church and all, but the other was down at the lower end of Jantaburi province, down in the southeastern part of Thailand. Well, since Maxine, my wife, was the Baptist press rep, they sent word, we want you to cover this story. We want you to know about what our volunteer medical teams are doing, because we had folks getting ready to come out and help care for the refugees. There was so much malaria and other diseases. I think the U.S. Army said that area coming across there was one of the highest malaria areas in the world. But anyhow, Maxine, the two of us, I went with her, and we went to the camp, at one particular camp, several times. The Vietnam place where they were staying was close by, so she spent time there. She observed and wrote about it and interviewed a lot of the refugees. That was part of her learning process, both the Cambodians and the Vietnamese. The first time we went down to the camp, we had a wonderful surprise. There, I might cry about this, there was one of our MK girls working in the lab. And I was so happy to see her. She was like one of our own kids, So that was a special treat that we didn't know we were going to get to have. But anyhow, so Maxine, we were there. She talked to some patients in we called it a hospital, and it was kind of a thatched roof, open building. And Penny Shelton was busy checking the blood and all those things to try to figure out what to do for them. While we were there, I think it was our first time, because we went several times. This covered several years during that whole time, but I'm trying to remember what was so special about the first one, extra special besides Penny. I remember they had a group of Cambodians, this is a little bit later, but we had a whole big bunch of Cambodian soldiers. They were whatever they called, not the Viet Cong, the Khmer Rouge. They came across one day. Now this was several miles away from the camp and the hospital, But we heard that they got where they were coming, so we were down there with the medical team, and there was about 5,000. They came across with their black pajamas on and their caps. And the border between Thailand and Cambodia was just a little ditch, I remember. There were some Thai soldiers along there, but they let them come across. They laid down their rifles and came on in. And they'd been in the jungle for many days, and they told these horrific stories about the fact that they were being pursued by the Vietnam soldiers. And I don't know how many, but some of their babies they had to actually put to death because they were crying and giving away the location of their camp. Well, when we heard this, I know Maxine couldn't hardly take it. I mean, it was terrible, but that was the reality. They'd been eating bark and leaves and whatever they could get to just survive. So they were really low in energy. I don't remember what the word was, but I couldn't do much, you know. We couldn't speak Cambodian, and I couldn't do medicine, but they gave me a real good job. They gave me a big bucket of homemade Gatorade to try to give as many as one of them would drink it and, help build them up. So I had one little plastic glass, and I carried it around. And usually, these folks, most of them were fairly young. They would be sitting, trying to find some shade and kind of gathered together in little groups. And sometimes nobody would take it, so I had to pass on. But a lot of times, if the first person would take it and drink it, then I could fill up another glass and each one of them would drink it. So I got to meet most all of them in a way, But I thought later about what Jesus said about giving out a glass of cold water. So I think I got to give out about 700 of them that day. So I was happy with that. In addition, we had doctors on our team, and they could tell pretty well right off which ones of them were the most seriously ill. And so I got to help one of our doctors from down in Texas. We helped load some of them get up on the camp truck. We had straw and mats laying there in the back of the truck, and they could lay on that to take them to the hospital. And this I found out about later. When we were home on our next furlough, I had a call from some friends over in West Alabama that had been my church members when I was in seminary and had pastored their church way down in the piney woods of southwest Alabama. Well, they had moved up to another town, but they called me and they said, Brother Bob said, we saw some pictures from the refugee camp. Said, did you happen to have on a red cap? I said, yes, I bought one at Chaco Springs. They said, well, we saw your picture helping some of the Cambodians get in the truck. So probably the only time I've ever been on CBS. Well, anyhow, I was mainly the driver and help her what I could, and Maxine stayed real busy getting pictures and interviews. And a little bit later, when the Viet Cong Khmer Rouge had to start vacating when the Vietnamese army were chasing them, we actually had to build a separate section in the camp. And Brother Dan Cobb, he and his wife were the ones living down there, and he was the one that helped purchase tarps and plastic and whatever to help build these, places for stay. And then his wife, Fan, was in charge of the kitchen and with getting the food for him. So he told me later, he said they had to be real careful because this new group coming in had actually probably murdered some of the friends of the first group. So they kept them separated by a pretty good bit, but we still tried to minister to them. And I remember a picture of Maxine interviewing one of the Khmer Rouge. I don't know if he's a general or a colonel, but he was one of their officers. And of course, in the camp, they were very docile, and realized, I think, what they'd done. But anyhow, they were dependent on us to help them. We also tried to, some of our doctors, when they could, because this is way out in the country there in the jungle of Thailand, where Thai people would get sick too, and it was hard for them to get any medical help. So if they had finished rounds at the refugee camp and had some time, they would go out into the villages there in the Thailand area and try to minister to them. But it was a wonderful work, and Dan and some of the folks that worked there regularly witnessed and taught, and they had Bible classes, and there was a great response to the gospel there. We had, I don't know, there was probably at least over 1,000 of the refugees that accepted Christ as their Savior. And I know when I pray for them, try to pray every day around the country, I pray for the, what do I call them, the refugee children of the Lord. And of course, when they moved on to other parts of the world, quite a few of them to America, we're still praying for them that their faith will hold and that it's helped them through this horrible time. But so it was a great ministry, both physically and spiritually. And all of our medical teams, including Penny Shelton, had a great part in it. Our part was basically to observe and maybe help a little bit that we could, and then get the news. And the Commission magazine carried a number of stories that Maxine had written at their request. They wanted this. And we did go to one or two other camps just to observe and maybe get some stories. But Gamput, was that Penny, remember? Sometimes I can remember, sometimes I can't. So now that was probably 250 miles from our house, but it was well worth taking some time out from our regular work. And maybe I'll add this a little bit, because later on, when I talked to our Baptist folks about that and show them pictures, I said, this is kind of general, but I said, if you want to get the most bang out of your buck to give to missions, you need to send it through our Southern Baptist channels. Other mission groups work in refugee camps and other kind of work, but they have all these overhead expenses and travel. I remember when we were working in the refugee camp one time, we stayed in a little motel close by, and there were some nurses there from the International Red Cross, and there was a little swimming pool. And I heard them talking, and they were talking about how much money they got. They paid for their travel, their housing, they paid extra for their hardship work, and they were making a huge salary. This was coming from donations. Our folks were doing it along with our regular work. So it didn't cost Baptists anything extra for our part. The teams that came special, that was they were supported to get their travel. I'm sure they didn't make a lot of money off of it. But think about that. You know, some of our Baptist folks, and I've heard it in Sunday school and so on, they're sending money to other groups, but they could be doing so much more with it by sending it through our channels, because we had our regular salary and some travel built into it for our regular work, and it didn't cost anything extra. So I thought, why, let's try to educate and it's not like you're putting other people down, and we don't want them to think we don't appreciate them, but we're just trying to help do the most work that we can with the money that we give. So I didn't even know about, well, I started out, I was baptized as American Baptist in Nebraska. And Uncle Sam brought me to Alabama, and the Lord led me to a church here near my Army post. And I started going there, and I started learning about two things: cooperative program and Lottie Moon Christmas offering. And I was 18, but that just impressed me. First of all, cooperative program, every church of any size, they can designate through the cooperative program, they have a part in all our work. You don't have to be a mega church to support missionaries. So all these small churches were having a part in the refugee work too. So every Southern Baptist has an active part in supporting our work, no matter how big the church is, if they want to do it. Okay, then I learned about the Lottie Moon offering. And I'd always felt like Jesus was getting the short end of the stick at Christmas time, if you'll let me say it that way. And some of our Thai pastors asked me one day, said, this was later, but it kind of figures in. He said, is it true that Christians in America celebrate Jesus' birthday by giving gifts to each other? They didn't really believe it, but they asked me. They said, the wise men didn't do that. I said, no. And so they pinned me down. They said, is that true? Well, I had to admit that it was true, but that it was kind of like the Thai New Year's when they give love gifts. But what I'm getting around to saying is that the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, since I've been a Southern Baptist, has been one of the most special parts of my life as far as my stewardship goes. And every year when I can send the bigger check I can send, the happier I am. And of course, the Lottie Moon offering was supporting our refugee work too. So folks, just know that, think about Jesus' birthday and what it means, and I think you'll get a lot of joy out of really. I don't know how much you give now, but if you can give more, you'll be real happy with it. Well, that's not too far away from the refugee camp. When Bob asked me if I could talk about the refugee, I said, if you don't mind me wandering off a little bit, but it's really connected, because I don't know in the churches how much was said, but that money you were already giving is what made it possible for our teams to go and for the wonderful work that was able to be done. One of our special ministries at the mission hospital was our work with the leprosy patients. Well, we built a separate building called the leprosy building. It was like a dormitory with rooms on either side for the men and women, and an open room out in the front where we could have meetings and worship and do our help them get ready for surgery. One of our missionary doctors was a skilled surgeon, and he studied with a leprosy specialist and learned how. The main thing that we did was he transplanted tendons. Like if people's fingers pulled up like this, they called it monkey claw, and they did that with leprosy if they had it a while. They could open up those fingers and transplant some tendons there and hold them up. But in order to do the surgery well, they had to come in early, and we'd have hot wax in a couple of basins there, put their hands in that, let them get warmed up, and then show them how to massage their fingers out like this. They would do that before surgery and then do it some more afterwards to be sure they didn't draw back up. They also transplanted tendons in their feet because they tend to get very weak ankles, and I'm not sure how he did that, but he put some tendons from somewhere down there and helped hold them up straight and steady where they could walk without a limp. So we started bringing the folks in. We found out we had a leprosy clinic in a nearby town, and when they located folks that could use the surgery, they would bring them to the hospital, and they could stay there as long as they needed to. And then when their fingers or their feet were ready, they would bring them into our surgery room inside the hospital and fix them. So most of these people were there for quite a while. And like I said, lepers in Thailand were pretty well looked down on, just like everywhere else at that time. And not quite like the Bible, although a lot of them, they couldn't be around other people. They were not contagious. Now, this makes a difference. It's not like catching a cold. They were infectious. That means if they had a sore on their hand, say, and put it down on top of a table, and if a well person came along that had maybe a sore or a blister, an open place in their hand, if they put it on top of that where those germs were, they could possibly catch it. The germs didn't live very long out in the sunshine, and so there was really very little chance of us getting the leprosy. We tried to be a little careful, but we also tried to be friendly and let them know that we weren't afraid of them. We didn't look down on them. They were just as good as we were. And these folks, I'd say it's like a flower opening to the sun. They had never been treated with respect or kindness or like another human being. And our doctors showed them, and we showed them Christian love and kindness. And it was just a wonderful ministry. And they loved to listen to the Bible stories. We had teaching out there, and we had Sunday services out there. And they had some prayer meetings at night. What we called our mom and dad of the building, they were both people with arrested cases of leprosy. You couldn't actually cure leprosy where it would never be a problem, but if they would take just kind of look like an aspirin tablet once a day. Sometimes they didn't have to take it that often, but they would gradually be where they were not infectious, and the disease would not spread any further in their body, because if you didn't stop it, some of the older folks that came in that hadn't had any help, some of them didn't have their fingers. They had already fallen off with the leprosy, and some of the ears were gone, and their noses and their faces were all deranged. They were all ugly because of all those scars. And of course, they were very self-conscious and all. But when they started getting taken care of and started treated with respect and kindness, they were very open to the gospel message, more so than other Thai people. And the love of Jesus and the love of the Father meant so much to them. And one of the most special part of the teaching in the Bible was the resurrection day and our new resurrected bodies. And they learned that, if they trusted in the Lord, when He came back, they were going to get a perfect new body. It wouldn't be leprosy anymore. So it was wonderful to work with them, and I was a chaplain at the hospital at the time, and Maxine went out with me to help with the music, and Ajahn Manop, who was the leprosy building father, he was a good musician too, and they even put on some plays. In addition to doing that regular work, we would have leprosy Bible conferences, and there would be other lepers. Probably a lot of them had already been treated, but they could come in and join with us, and we had just like a camp for about a week. And they ate together, they fixed their food, and we had meetings a couple times a day, Bible study and preaching. And a lot of times some of them would put on a drama and play for us. But it was my privilege. I mean, I never thought I'd get to do this. But when the first 12 of our lepers made their decisions for Christ and said they wanted to follow Him in baptism, I had the privilege of baptizing them. I mean, it was such a special day. Our Thai business manager of the hospital, he lived fairly close by, and he had a pond of water out in back. I don't know if I remember telling Bob this story. I probably did, but this fella, Kun Supachai, like I said, he was a wonderful Thai Christian, and he was the one that would, when people came to pay their bills or they couldn't pay it at the hospital because they were poor, but he would talk with them, and they would give a little bit and bring some more back later, and they didn't lose their respect by just having everything free. So he knew, he was very good with them. Well, earlier on, when we got the land for our church there, our Thai pastor was still in seminary, and so I was filling in for a few weeks. And I called for a work day on Saturday one day. We wanted to clean off all the bushes and, clear the land to build the building and maybe start building a little fence around there. And I was a little disappointed because we didn't have as big a turnout, but we had some. And we were working over there, and the missionary doctors were working with me. And Mr. Supachai I saw him across the street behind a tree looking over there. Well, later he came to me and apologized, and he said, John Bob, he said, I'm sorry, I'm ashamed that I didn't come over and work. He said, I was afraid because he had about the highest position of any Thai person in our hospital. He was afraid that people would see him over there doing gardener's work and they would not respect him because he had a position that is very important in Thai society. But later, like I said, he was very sorry. Well, that day, I did not know he was going to do this. When I got out in that pond, about waist deep, because these are shorter people, I was getting ready to go over and help him in. Well, there he was, right by me. He walked over there and took each one by the hand and led them out there so I could baptize them. I mean, that was almost as exciting as doing the baptizing. Well, anyhow, we baptized them that day, got them back to the hospital, and they went on preparing for surgery, or if they had it, this this work went on, and when they were able to go home, they went home, and quite a few of them, myself and our clinic leader over in the province, we went out to visit every Thursday afternoon, and we tried to get in all of those homes, the ones that had been baptized, and encourage them. Well, when everybody learned that this disease, they'd had their pills and it was safe to be together, then they started being able to go to our church there with everybody else. But we still had night meetings at night, some for them. And they loved to sing, and Maxine had a big part in that. So every Christmas time, they were allowed to go Christmas caroling to the homes of the missionaries and the Thai pastor. Now, the other members of the church were going places around. I usually went out with the kids, but Maxine went with the Supachai in the truck with our leprosy patients. And the missionary wives would fix the cookies and other sweets, for them to have for their treat when they got back to the building. The reason we didn't do it in our homes, they were very self-conscious, and some of them couldn't hold a fork or spoon. The others would help them because their fingers were gone. And they were just, more comfortable by themselves. But everybody welcomed they would come into the yard, and the doctors and families would go out and listen to them and thank them and join in the prayers that they said. They would usually go and sing a Thai, well, they were our Christmas carols, but they'd sing it in the Thai language. About the last year we were there, the leprosy patients told Maxine they wanted to learn to sing Silent Night in English. If they could do anything in English, it just boosted they felt like it was something special, because these folks, a lot of them hadn't been to school hardly any, or maybe the 4th grade. They lived out in the country. Some of them were actually, I know one well-to-do family made their leprosy son live in a little thatch hut out behind the house with all kind of shrubs around it, and they took him to the clinic at night when nobody could see him. They were embarrassed, and you know how that made him feel. So they hadn't had a chance to do much in English, which just was special to them. In fact, before that, for some time, when we had visitors to the hospital, some of them were our Baptist folks from Americans that were at the English church in Bangkok. They would come out, and sometimes other folks would come to see the hospital, and they always wanted to go out and see the lepers, of course, and the leprosy work. Well, at first, before Maxine got into it, they would just be out there like at a zoo, This is a unusual thing, and people had heard about it, so they just stand out there and look at him for a while. And we all felt embarrassed for them, and wanted them to be able to have some conversation with the visitors. So Maxine taught them some simple sentences, and then she wrote them out and gave copies to the visitors when they came, so they would know, what the leprosy folks knew, and they could talk pretty good with those. So that was another big hit, and that helped their morale and their self-respect and their feeling of confidence in themselves. Well, when Christmas started coming, when they wanted to sing Silent Night in English, my smart wife, who said she couldn't speak Thai very well, and she could. Now, she was a farm girl from Marshall County, up close to Arab, and the Lord called her just like He did me, but she felt like she couldn't be a missionary because she hadn't been to seminary and all that. But I've told you about a lot of her work. So anyhow, she turned out to be the perfect one here, and she figured out. Now the Thai language is totally different. I've told you a little bit about it, but she could put the Thai symbol up there, the letter, and when you read it in Thai, it didn't mean anything. But if you said it like was written, it came out Silent Night, Holy Night, the whole song. And so that's how they learned the words. Well, they went out that night and came to one of our doctor's homes, and they were in the front yard there starting to sing their Thai songs, and the family came out on the front porch where they could be close to them. Well, Maxine told me that Ajahn Manok, I was telling you about him, he's the one that played the accordion that night while she was there helping him. So they had their Thai songs, and they had a prayer, and a little word from him, and she said she could tell he was starting to play the last song. No, he was starting to lead the last prayer. And she just started playing. No, she had the accordion. I got mixed. She started playing it, and they started singing Silent Night. And the doctor's eyes were full of tears. The family was rejoicing with him. So that was a big accomplishment and a wonderful Christmas Eve for all the families that got to hear him sing. And when we were getting ready to retire, we had several places where churches and groups had send-off for us, but the last one was at the church there at the hospital town. And all country people from all around, the Christians, came in for that night. We had a nice meal, and then the service was basically a fellowship, a lot of songs, kind of ways thanking us, and so on. And at the very last, Maxine and I were sitting on the second pew. I was on the aisle, she was by me. One of our leper friends that she'd meant so much to him. He was one of our older pastors, actually, but he had gotten so much help with the leprosy building. He had gone to the market and bought this rose, single rose in a plastic holder with some greenery around it. He came down to where we were sitting. He reached across me and handed that to Maxine, and he put whatever was left of his hand around her hands, and he prayed for her and gave her a blessing. I've heard her tell that she cries every time like I do. And I think that was one of the most touching times in her missionary career. Right after that, one of our pastors stood up in the front and he said, when you get back to America, tell our Southern Baptist brothers and sisters how much we appreciate them. He said, you folks who are halfway around the world, you don't even know us, but you loved us and cared enough to send missionaries to tell us about the true God. And we tried to do that in churches all across America where we could get to them, and I'm certainly telling you again here. Before I close it out, I want to mention what an experience it was for us, and how much we thank all of you for making it possible for us to go. I know the Lord called us, and we wouldn't have gone otherwise, but He used you to make it possible. And you know, probably know the first 3 verses of Philippians where Paul wrote back to the church after they said help. And he referred to them that he praised the Lord and thanked them for their being partners in the gospel. And that's what's happened. We got to go, and you folks backed us up and made it possible for us to go. And while we were over there serving the Lord and trying to preach on the streets and in the churches and everywhere that we could have an influence and show the love of Christ through our medical work, through the years that we were there, 35 years, I was just amazed at how we had the privilege of meeting and talking with and witnessing to people in every level of Thai society. And not only that, people from the States that we probably wouldn't have met if I was still a country preacher in Alabama. We had several of the presidents of the Southern Baptist Convention eat in our home. One of them, he was formerly governor of Oklahoma, and I got to translate for him in an outdoor preaching. Of course, at the top, we met, talked with the King and Queen of Thailand. We went to the governor's home every Christmas Eve at the church and sang there. We knew mayors and other public officials. When we lived in Bangkok for those 3 years, we just had to find a rented house, you know, to live in temporarily. We had no idea. It was not a big fancy neighborhood, but we got there springtime, and on toward Christmas, we felt like we'd like to invite our neighbors in to celebrate Christmas and, you know, have some refreshments and get acquainted. And so I wrote out some cards, and the lady that helped us took them around to about, 1, 2, 3, 4 different homes that were closest by. One of them was our landlady, and we'd had a little delay in getting the money to pay her right at first because our mission treasurer was out of the country, but we worked that out. She had a picket fence, and she could look through this to our front, our living room. Well, I don't think I've told you about Maxine playing the Thai instrument in this version of it. And she did over the years. She learned to play. It was like a Thai xylophone made out of wood and bamboo. Had a beautiful sound. It was the lead orchestra in the old Siamese classical orchestra. She knew that if we wanted to do some Thai music, that this would be the best accompaniment, you know, the Thai style music. So she kept working, had folks at our hospital sing to her where she could listen. There weren't any notes written out. And they sat on the floor in the living room at our house in Bangkok. And she said one night when she went to bed, those 4 tunes popped into her head. She got up, went to the Renat, and sat down and played all 4 of them. So that was her start. All right, we had it with us when we moved to Bangkok. And she kept it on the floor in our living room and enjoyed playing on it. Well, the landlady, she was there, and we had a doctor and his wife were both doctors across the street. Next door to us was a family, and then another family. They all came to the gate that night that we invited them. We had a little short patio in front of the house. They all came there and took their shoes off. And the lady on the left side of us, she said, "I want to know who plays the Renat Ek in this house." She could hear Maxine playing through the windows, but we had some kind of leafy plants between us and their fence. It was close, but it was covered up. She said, I got down low as I could. I walked around, I went upstairs, but she never could get a look through our windows. Well, when she asked that, it was so interesting. Our landlady, who had, well, you know, we didn't talk. I took the money over every month, so we hadn't had any real conversations. But we had seen her standing there watching Maxine play. She stepped over and put her arm around her waist, and she said, "Oh, that's my good friend, Coon Maxine." She became her good friend all of a sudden. Well, we were happy, and that lady actually went to the student center later and studied some with Maxine. But anyhow, okay, we found out that the lady on the left side was the first cousin of the Queen. She was a royal princess. Before that, let me back up a little bit. She sent us a thank you note before we ever had to get together. And she signed it with some letters on the end, and we asked our helper, her name was Kunmugi, she said, I don't know exactly what that is, but it stands for a royal family. Maxine said, I don't know if we want to go through with this. We never entertained royalty, and what do you do? How do you act with them, you know? I said, hon, we'll just treat them like anybody else, and it'll probably work out, so okay. Okay, so she's there. Her husband was president of the Thai Telephone Company. The next man over was charge of the royal treasury for the king. As I said, the couple across from us were both doctors. He was administrator of the biggest government hospital in Thailand. His wife was folks that read x-rays, I can't think of the name, at another big hospital. Well, we had a wonderful evening. They were just as down to earth. Many of them had studied some English overseas, so we talked Thai some and English some, and sang Christmas carols and had punch and cookies, and I mean, just like any other friends. Okay, the next year, we had a sit-down meal for them, and then the third year, the royal lady invited us over to her house for a Christmas supper. We told her we've got to, promise to go to one of the churches there for Christmas, but she said, come on back when you get home, it won't be too late. When we got home, they had a buffet table out in their side yard, which, now their house was nice, but it wasn't a palace or anything. And everybody, I think, had eaten, so they invited us to walk through the buffet lines. And these 5 ladies there were serving our plates. They were dressed to the nines with royal-type clothes on. They served our plates, and when we got to the end, one of their husbands said, have you all ever been served by 5 royal Thai princesses, by 5 royal princesses before? I said, no, sir, we never have. This is very special. Okay, we ate, and then we all went in a little side room. It was their music room. They had a piano. We were in with there was the 5 ladies and their families and the hostess there. We sang Christmas carols. We sang songs out of a little, seemed like it was an orange songbook that I sang out of in grade school. We sang Billy Boy, Darling Clementine. I don't remember what else, but I was sitting there, is this a dream? In the middle of Bangkok, Thailand, singing these songs with these Thai folks. But it was a wonderful evening, and most of them knew English. Some had studied England, Australia, Switzerland, America, so we mostly sang in English that night. Well, that was wonderful. And when we got back to Chatsingstow after our furlough, on one special holiday, I forgot where Thai people like to travel around, and our neighbor lady with all of her sisters came out in a Volkswagen van, came to visit us, so we had another get together at our house. And I had a chance to give each one of them my book on how to be a Christian. I hope it meant something to them. I hope they learned. But okay, that was one very special experience. Well, my doctor across the street now, the doctor that we got to know there, he came to him one day and invited me to join his Thai-speaking Rotary Club in Bangkok. He said, I've told him that you speak Thai well enough, you won't have any problem. Well, I said, I want to, and if I want to, and I will when I was filling in at the business office at that time. And when our regular missionary got back, I did join the club. These were they were businessmen, lawyers, doctors, Army officers, professors. We had to meet every Monday with the Rotary Club, and they had a practice of each new member should speak and tell them why they wanted to be a Christian. Well, before this happened, they had a big meeting out at one of the parks there from Rotarians all over Thailand. And they wanted to know who would volunteer to go. Well, I didn't say anything, but nobody else volunteered, so they asked me if I would go represent that club for them. I did. I met a lot of guys just briefly, but at lunchtime, fellas were sitting down for lunch, and the vice premier next to the prime minister was there. He was a Rotarian. They invited him to sit with us, so I I'd met him, but I got to know him better. And I remember asking him, I said, Pichai Ratagun. I said, Mr. Pichai, I understand, how many people of each career or profession could be in each different Rotary Club? He said, we're limited to 2 from each profession, except for journalists and the clergy. Oh, I said, then you can have all the Buddhist monks you want. He just gave out a snort. He said, I'm talking about Christian clergy. He said, the monks don't do anything for anybody but themselves. So he but he was probably Buddhist in name, but he had studied overseas, and we had the president of Rotary International from Birmingham came through, and we had a dinner for him, and that night Mr. Pichai said a lot of good things about Christianity. And I left him my book, a couple of different books, and talked with him a little bit, discussed it, and I'm hoping that, something will come from that. Well, after that, they asked me to speak, like I said, so I had my chance. I talked what Jesus said about servants are the greatest of all, and Rotarians have a motto, service above self. And I went with some of them on medical things around town. So that day they listened to just what I had to say. And then at the end of it, I took Maxine with me so we could do the Thai music. It was down, like a horseshoe table, U-shape, and our Renat was down at the end, and I played the little cymbals. So we did 2 songs, 2 of the Thai songs that they were Thai hymns with written to Thai music that she played. And when she started playing, those businessmen generals, lawyers, whatever. They stood up and started applauding. I don't think they'd ever heard maybe a white woman play that instrument, but she played it well, and they gave her a big ovation. And when she got through, a bunch of them came down to talk to her. They said, "Who was your teacher?" She said, "I did not have a human teacher." Said, "Jesus taught me." They looked kind of critical. They said, "We didn't know that Jesus knew Thai music." She said, "He knows all the music and everything in all the world, you know." And they later invited us back one time after we moved out to the country so she could play the piano for them to sing Christmas carols. So this, you know, these kind of people, we did not dream we'd ever meet folks like that or have any connection with them, but they just seem to be there sometimes. So this Pichai Ratchagun, one more thing. He was a very, okay, let me go back a minute. When I was away on one of our leadership schools, Maxine was in Bangkok doing interviews for her press reporter, you know. And she went to a grocery store. She stayed at our guest house there, bought some little few things of groceries, and she was crossing the big street. Right in the middle, you know, the zebra stripes, a lot of people use zebra stripes so you'd be safe, because there was a train crossing and a heavy bar up above that they put down when the train came through. She was right where she's supposed to be, and they let that bar down and hit her. The foot part that came down hit her right in the head and cut her, and she was bleeding profusely. The groceries kept her from going all the way to the ground. But a little Chinese lady in a store right on the sidewalk helped her get to the sidewalk and sit down in a chair, and brought her some towels to put over her head. She said, "I don't know how clean they were," but she put them there to stop the blood. And about that time, a lady from Australia who worked with the Christian group Feeding the Children, she came along and she got out in that street and stopped one of the three-wheeled bicycle things, a Samlaw it was called. She stopped all the traffic. He drove over and let Maxine get in that little go-kart, I don't know how to describe it, but a little three-wheeled traveling thing. Took her to the back street to get to a hospital. And they kind of stopped it up for so much bleeding, and a couple of missionary friends took her on over to another hospital, and they fixed her up there, but they wouldn't give her blood. He was afraid of whether the blood was safe or not, so he told her to go home and eat a lot of raisins and grape juice, so she did that. Well, in this story, I took pictures to show how that bar came down where it wasn't supposed to. We wanted them to change, you know, make it safe. Maxine said if that was a child or an elderly child, it would probably kill them. It was that serious. So I didn't know anybody in the Bangkok government, so I wrote a letter to my old friend Pichai. And he responded very graciously. He said, "I went to the train tracks, it's just like you said it was, and we're going to take care of it." He said, "Thanks for being a good Rotarian." The next time we went to Bangkok, they had moved those stripes about 10 feet, make them very safe. With my dental work I had done at a clinic in Bangkok, and one day when I was in there, he was in, I realized we both used the same dentist. Later on, after Maxine's accident and the letter and all that, she went with me one day when I had to go get some work done there. We're sitting in there. I think had some fun out of them. When she got in there, they brought her a piece of cake and a cup of coffee. I said, "Where's my coffee?" They said, "No, it's only for important people." So anyhow, we had fun out of that. But the main thing is, Peacheye came in a little bit later. He saw Maxine. He went over to her, lifted her up, and gave her a big hug. Asked her, he said, "Darling, how you doing?" You know, in English. He was really concerned. And so when we brag on important people, they say, "Have you ever been hugged by a vice premier?" You know, I don't know. Remember, let me think. Except for myself, I don't know of any other important people she got hugged by, except other missionaries. But maybe there's some more. But they were up at the top, and of course we worked with ordinary folks, all kind of farm folks. I spent a lot of time in their homes, and the poor people, and the lepers were probably the lowest on the totem pole. And I want to tell one story about one of the leper fellows. In fact, it's the same one that would not agree to earn his diploma I told you about a while ago because he didn't want to take the spotlight away from his daughter. Well, this is another time, and I used to drive, you know, I drove about 100 miles or so to the leadership school up by Cambodia. And some of the men that came from up north a little bit, they'd come down and wait at one of the junctions and ride with me the rest of the way. Well, he was from that area, and he usually came. But that day he was not there. I said, "Where's Lung Tanam?" Lung Tanam did not show up at our regular place. And I asked the other fellows, they said, "Oh, he's going to come on the train today." The train ran through there, not too far. Well, he'd have to come down to the same town, but it went right straight over to Satgao and get him off there, and it was just a couple miles to the church. So he rode the train and got off. We picked him up, and when it came time for testimony time, he was telling us about how his train ride. Well, as it happened, the Thai Ministry of Religion were kind. So if anybody we told them was a pastor, they would give him a half price, a ticket to ride half price on the train. And he had never tried it out, but he was going to try it out that day. So he went to the depot there to buy his ticket. And he's real short. He put it up on the counter. Well, first he said, "I want a half-price ticket to Satgao." Well, the guy selling ticket, you know, he could tell he was a leper. He said, kind of questioned him, you know, we didn't treat him very well. And he said, "Why do you think you can have a half-price ticket?" He said, "I took that clerical card and popped it on the counter." And the guy's eyes got real big, and he said, "Oh, okay." And he, you know, gave him his ticket. Well, when he told it to us, you could tell that was so satisfying, because he had been put down for years, you know, but now he had some status. And when I listened to him, I was just blown away. It was so special. So I've never forgotten that. Well, like I was telling you, we've had a chance to work with people all the way from the king and queen down to the lepers. Every level of society. We didn't work with all of them, but we met them, talked with them, and we worked with mostly the poor folks. When we spent those 3 years in Bangkok at the Student Center, when that was up, our mission group said, if you'd like to stay and continue doing that work at the center, you're welcome to. We'd be glad to have you. Well, we hadn't decided. I didn't figure we would. We were still thinking about it. And that last Sunday before we came home, we took our GI family. I told you about them out to visit. They wanted to see the town where we used to live and the hospital and all that. And this may be a repeat, but when we drove into our old hometown, and before we got there, the rice fields were blowing in the wind, and it's just like the Lord gave me a second calling, and that was to come back to the country work. And Mom was off or whatever the Lord was leading us to do. And she enjoyed the city. She would have stayed there and continued some good work, but other work was ahead of her, and that was, at the hospital basically, and the work she did there. But we went back to the country right away when furlough was over, and I've told you, a lot of things that we did after we got there. So I'm trying to think if there were any other unusual people that we met. Now, I did tell you about Maxine and Bob. They went to it was kind of monument dedication for the highway that the GIs had built from our town on up to the northeast. And they had a ceremony there. They had the monks chatting a while, and then people walked across the road to the monument. And Bob and our son Bob and Mom, their paths intersected with the Prime Minister, the American Ambassador, and the Army Chief of Staff, the Thai Army Chief of Staff. Bob had an accident on his bike, and he had a big white cast on his arm, very fresh. I don't know how you got started this conversation, son, but I know the Prime Minister asked if he could autograph it. And he did. He wrote it in English. He took almost the whole cast. Well, the American Ambassador followed suit, and he signed it, Mr. Graham Martin. The Thai Chief of Staff was going to sign it, and his ballpoint pen just got 1 point there, and it ran out of ink. Okay. Later, this is before we went to Bangkok, but the first 4th of July when we were in Bangkok, I got an invitation to a ceremony at the ambassador's house called the Vidyana. That had all of these ambassadors and high-ranking people there, and Prime Minister Tanam Gitikachan was there. And I went over and spoke to him. I said, do you remember that white boy that talked Thai with you out there at Phnom? He said, oh, I sure do. He said, listen, he talked real good Thai. I said, well, that's my son, So, I mean, that's just another example of, I do know the American ambassador and his wife came to the English-speaking church, and we talked to them some. And when Maxine was in the hospital for some surgery on Bob's birthday, the American ambassador's wife was in the hospital visiting, and she asked Maxine if there was anything she could do for us. Maxine said, well, my little boy's having a birthday today. I think it was about number 7. And I haven't been able to bake him a cake. And the lady said, I'll fix him one. She baked the cake and brought it to the hospital. So he's had a birthday cake by the American ambassador's wife. Okay, I think, see if I can think of anybody else. Let me just close and say again how much a big part that you folks had in our work. And I said it a while ago, that you are partners in the gospel. I remember Maxine was speaking to the church in Texas. She used the illustration about we were down, different places, and you folks were letting the rope down to us to let us down and help us back up. What was that town? It was where they had all the oil wells right in the middle of town. But the pastor there, we had a luncheon there. This was during the mission, World Missions Conference in that part of Texas. And he came to meet people who were lined up, people going in the buffet to eat lunch, and he came to me and he said, Brother Bob, he said, okay, he said, I want to tell you that your wife made the best missionary talk I've ever heard in my life last night. And he said our people were carried away with it. Well, I knew she could tell the story. And when we would go different places, we would take turn about. I would speak one night, she would speak the other. But one time we were in a church in Missouri, or Kansas, sorry. And it was my turn to talk, so I talked a while, and then something was said about the leprosy work. And I said, well, let Maxine talk to you. She started, they asking questions. I talked about 45 minutes before that. They kept her there an hour asking questions about leprosy. And later, he said, we want you back for the Lighting Moon Offering week to speak. And we said, well, we'll have to think about it. But when we got home, we felt like we didn't want them to spend all their money on airfare and stuff, and would probably have a better offering without us using that up. And so there were other missionaries closer by, but she felt unqualified to be a missionary, but maybe it was her teacher's experience. She taught 5 years, 3 of them before we got married and 2 afterwards. So, and she loved teaching. So, but you folks, and that includes especially, of course, our family at Hewletton and our family at Parker Memorial, where we have been associated for 65 years. So I might be a Nebraska boy, but I got a lot of Alabama in me and Thailand in me, and I feel right at home, and I thank you all for letting us be in your church too and being friends, and appreciate all of your support. Praise the Lord, and thank you very much. Amen.